John Watson, who lived between 1878 and 1958, was an American psychologist with a somewhat rocky childhood of his own due to his alcoholic dad and religious mother. Not just that, his career also had a rough patch as he was forced to resign due to his romantic affair with a colleague. While the previous psychologists did most of their experiments on animals, Watson wanted to observe humans, so he found a 9-month-old baby called Albert B. The purpose of the experiment was to find out if they could condition the baby to fear certain animals by accompanying that animal with scary noise. The baby was shown various animals like dogs, rats, monkeys, and rabbits. First, he was shown these animals and objects without the noise. As expected, the baby showed no fear of these animals. Then in the next step, the animal was paired with a loud, frightening noise. This resulted in the baby associating fear with the animals. Although such an experiment would not be possible today, it proved that Pavlov's conditioning applied to humans in the same way. What's worse, little Albert not only associated the white rat with fear, he was also frightened of anything similar to a white rat. So not only can we be conditioned to behave in a certain way, our emotional response can also be conditioned. In other words, the environment a child grows up in has a massive influence on their behavior as well as their emotional response. John Watson advocated parents to take a proactive approach to child rearing, which some criticize as too rigid and factory-like approach. His own childhood must have influenced his work, as later psychologists thought while his findings were remarkable, his prescriptions were not very helpful. With behaviorism taking a firm root in America in the 20th century, it became much closer to Darwinian evolutionary biology that learning is not a luxury but a necessity of life. In other words, our survival necessity is the mother of all inventions and learning. B.F. Skinner, who was born in 1904 and died in 1990, considered the most famous behaviorist psychologist, was an American who, despite wanting to be a writer, turned to behavioral psychology. Building upon Pavlov and John Watson's research, but just like his fellow countryman Edward Thorndike, he concluded that learning is primarily outcome-driven or result-based. Instead of a neutral stimulus like Pavlov and Watson's sound stimulus, he developed a physical lever for the animals to operate in order to get food. His experimental subjects were rats in boxes that had a bar fitted in. When the animals pressed the bar, first out of curiosity or deliberately or accidentally, food would appear. It turns out the rats only continued to press the bar if they previously received food. Those rats who didn't get food decreased or stopped doing so. So the learning was based on positive outcome. As he continued his experiments, while varying slightly, the conclusion was that rats were also learning to adapt to the changes that were happening to their environment. Animals learn to respond to positive and negative reinforcements based on their previous experiences. Not only that, the rats responded to stimuli that reduced their negative reinforcement in the shape of electric shock. It turned out the rats learn better through positive reinforcement than negative ones. So reward is better than punishment, or carrots are better than sticks. Skinner also found that different rats responded differently to different stimuli, concluding that rats' genetic makeup to a large part determine its intelligence or curiosity that favor them in the environment they are in. In other words, nature as well as nurture determine how a person or animal adapts to the environment they live in. Nature is the foundation, while nurture is the walls and roofs. Skinner also questioned traditional education by offering a more feedback-based teaching approach in which the teacher and student interact more often, not waiting until the student is done with the project. A more interactive education is more effective. His psychology is known as radical behaviorism, arguing that free will is nothing but an illusion. He even coined the term selection by consequences in reference to Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, that our behavior is determined by the consequences of our action. It is not a passive learning process but a somewhat dynamic one in which the subject presses a lever to receive food. In other words, we act and behave in a way that helps us get more positive outcomes and avoid negative outcomes. So, to sum up, Skinner continued behaviorist psychology but added a more proactive mechanism in his tests to observe that animals basically learn and respond to positive consequences better. It's all good and dandy to know how we learn based on good outcomes, but an important question is how to unlearn things. So far, we have only discussed how humans and animals learn, but we have not tackled the question how we can unlearn things. Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote about how we can be contaminated by bad ideas and would be awesome if we could unlearn some terrible things. It would make life a bit easier to unlearn bad things we have learned, either voluntary or involuntary. The old saying that once learned cannot be unlearned, but our next psychologist is trying to show that we can actually unlearn things as we learn things. I discussed in Pavlov's experiments that we learn things by association, but we can also unlearn through association or dissociation. Joseph Wolpe, who was born in 1915 and died in 1997, was a South African-born American psychologist who is credited with a new technique in behavioral therapy. He understood that humans cannot be anxious and relaxed at the same time. If someone is relaxed, he's not anxious, and vice versa. He asked his patients to imagine the past events that gave them anxiety. When they showed signs of distress, he would ask them to stop imagining and relax. He would repeat this process a few times, and within a short time, the patient would be reconditioned to associate the distressing events with feeling relaxed. This went against the psychotherapy practice that tried to get to the bottom of the trauma or to root cause to alleviate it. Instead, he focused on the symptoms and associated those symptoms with relaxation in the present. This technique of desensitizing the patient to their traumatic experience allowed reconditioning the brain to focus on the present relaxation, not the traumatic past events. So this went against the grain because in order to treat someone from past trauma, he introduced the past enough times so that patients felt desensitized. In other words, in order to get rid of a phobia, one has to touch the spider. It simply tricks the brain to associate fear or trauma with good stuff. If you add enough sugar to something bitter, it becomes sweet. To sum up, the behaviorist school of psychology started with Ivan Pavlov's environmental conditioning experiments. Then the Americans carried experiments on other animals and humans. Later on, the Russians focused more on the brain side as they saw psychology part of physiology, and the Americans more focused on learning and education. So American behaviorists Skinner, Watson, Wolpe, and others concluded positive reinforcements was better than negative ones. Today we associate positivity with Americans and brooding pessimism with the Russians. Behaviorists looked at how behavior was established in animals by restricting or providing conditions for a desired outcome. You can train a dog to behave in certain ways which often goes against their innate instinctive response. While those instincts cannot be eliminated through conditioning, animals have the capacity to learn and adapt to new conditions. So learning is closely tied to survival and adaptation to the environment. So we behave and learn to behave that guarantees our survival. Food is the best way to train an animal.